Hey there, my friends. Welcome back to this series about peaceful communication, nonviolent communication plus Jesus. Last time we talked about a general overview of how in all of our communication we want to think about what we're observing in the world. We want to pay attention to our feelings. We want to connect our feelings to our needs, and then we want to make a request of another person. Today, I want to talk about observation and what that means. When Marshall Rosenberg talks about observing the world around us, what he's saying is that we need to slow down our experience of the conversation that we're in, the reality we're experiencing. Take just a moment to do a little self-scan and do a little paying attention to what's happening in the other person. So observing without judgment what is actually happening is helpful. And sometimes it's helpful to actually name what you're seeing. So let's say that I'm in a conflicted conversation and everything's kind of heating up and the other person's saying blah, 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 and that's getting me upset, and I'm saying blah, 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 and we're kind of escalating things. You've probably never been in a conversation like that, right? Of course you have. So have I. What Rosenberg is saying is we need to kind of slow that experience down a little bit by taking a deep breath within ourselves and actually paying attention to what you're observing in the other person and what you're observing within yourself. Let's talk a little bit about what you might be observing in the other person as you are engaging in this conflicted conversation. You might hear the person's volume escalating as they're starting to shout. You might see their body kind of adopt a defensive sort of position. You might see them kind of tuck in on themselves. You might see, if you're talking to a grumpy teenager, you might see them kind of like not look at you or dismiss you or that kind of a thing. By paying attention to what you're actually observing in the physical world, you're paying attention to the reality you're experiencing. And sometimes it's even helpful to name that reality, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the first thing is just imagine, and I want you to go back to, remember we were working on that sentence last time where we said, when this happens, I feel. What I'd like to invite you to do is when this person does this thing, I want you to go back in your mind and imagine that person the person who's doing the thing that bothers you, right? I want you to think about that person. Imagine that moment where the thing that's happening that bothers you is happening. Take a minute to write down a few observations about that person. If you're having a conflict with your spouse is doing something you don't like, is it that their back is turned to you? They're walking out of the room. It's hard to get them to sit down and look you in the eye. Is it that they're angry, that they are getting bigger in the space to try to, in menacing in a kind of way? Is it that the color on their face is getting red because they're getting really angry? Do you see the veins in their neck? Are they trying to control themselves? Are they curling up their... Really just pay attention to what are you actually observing about the person and their reality in the midst of this thing that's happening that bothers you, right? So first thing, take a few minutes, write down what are you observing in the other person when they're doing the thing that bothers you. Now I want to focus in a little bit about learning to pay attention to ourselves, because nonviolent communication works both with others and in ourselves. And one of the beautiful things about it is the person you're having the issue with, you don't have to send them to a nonviolent communication seminar or make them watch all these videos in order for nonviolent communication to work. By you observing what's happening in them and by you paying attention to what's happening in you, that observation can help you just by yourself de-escalate and remove the violence from this tense situation in order to create the space for a nonviolent solution. So let's think about what's happening in me, right? And this is where your self-knowledge, you can Pray your way through a conflict, and I encourage you to do that. If you're in a conflicted situation with a person, you're having trouble talking to your parents, you're having trouble talking to a classmate, a loved one, someone that you're in a relationship with, a coworker at work, use these techniques of observation, writing down what you see them doing. Also write down what you see, what's happening in yourself, but do it in the context of prayer. Invite God through the Holy Spirit to inform you, help you notice what's actually happening in the other person, and invite the Holy Spirit to do a kind of scan of your heart and your soul in order to help you become more aware of what happens in you in the midst of a conflicted situation. So as you're observing yourself, imagine yourself in the midst of that situation, that conflict, that argument, that thing that the person does that bothers you. And I find, you can see me already, I find closing my eyes and sort of scanning down into my heart is a helpful way to begin. Get a comfortable place to sit. Imagine that you're in that conflicted situation. You've paid attention to what the other person is doing, but now scan into your own self, and you will probably begin to feel in your body what you feel when that conflict is happening. You might feel your shoulders kind of hunch up like this. You might feel yourself going into a defensive posture, or you might feel yourself getting into an aggressive posture, getting yourself bigger in the room. You might feel your heart start to flutter or to beat faster. You might start to feel your breath getting a little bit shallower because your body is getting tense. You might find yourself clenching your fists. As you imagine yourself in that conflict, really pay attention to what's happening in your body. And maybe write those things down. Because long term, as part of the spiritual practice of nonviolence, learning to observe others and to observe ourselves in the midst of a conflicted situation and providing a little bit of space between what I say and what's happening, my observation, it really helps. And that's part of the developing of this spiritual practice of being able to be mindful and present, paying attention to what's happening in you and what you're observing in the other person. And I want to talk a little bit, just to wrap up this conversation about observation, I want to talk a little bit about feelings, because the next thing we're going to talk about in the next video is about feelings themselves, and about how feelings are actually our body's way of experiencing and cataloging and remembering what has happened to us. So your body actually carries the conflict, the stress, the emotion of every conflict you've ever had. And as your body experiences that conflict, that stress, that tension, that abuse, your body is actually physically registering that, and your brain is actually rewiring itself to create ways to protect you and to provide safety. So next time we're going to talk about feelings and how feelings are actually your body's physical way of absorbing the impact of what you're experiencing. But before we get into that, take some time to observe what happens to your body when you experience this kind of conflict. And what do you notice happening in the other person? We'll see you next time.